The convention also faced no shortage of problems closer to home, as pressure from the Hébertistes was boiling over. Promises made in the constitution were one thing, and lived reality was another. In early September, the reality was that Paris was again experiencing a dire shortage of bread. Beyond the obvious depletion of resources wrought by war, more ill-timed droughts had caused poor harvests. This, of course, drove bread availability down, and prices way up. It was the opinion of the sans-culottes that grain hoarders were to blame. A radical section issued a series of demands to the convention on the 2nd of September, requiring them to seize grain hoarders, war profiteers and other counter-revolutionaries, and put them to death. The section also demanded that limits be placed on how much property a private citizen could own. The convention was already in the process of breaking up the estates of former nobles and parceling them out to rural peasants to curry favour. Why couldn't the urban peasants expect similar measures in the towns and cities? Balking, the convention ignored these demands, leading many sans-culottes to take their agitations to the streets. Here, they spontaneously adopted a very class-conscious rhetorical line, casting themselves as the downtrodden poor, oppressed by the untrusty wealthy, who in their minds hoarded grain and plotted against the revolution. Hébert put these suspicions into words. One excerpt from Père Duchesne reads, "The rich think only of their interests. They are the Republic's greatest enemy. They despise the revolution because it has established liberty and equality. Fuck, we've got to finish this off. Shudder then, bastards and bloodsuckers of the people. The same muscle that pickled the throne of the jackass Capet will fall on you." Hébert used this energy to call for a journée on September 5th. Not quite as many people turned out as he hoped, only a few hundred, but these were hardline Hébertistes. And besides which, the Paris Commune was now dominated by Hébertistes, and Henriot controlled the National Guard. A few hundred was more than enough. Bursting inside the Tuileries Theatre, the Hébertistes brought the day's proceedings to a screeching halt, and spoke over any delegate who tried to restore order. It was a strange day to arrive. Recently completed were two of David's masterpieces, The Death of Marat and The Death of Lepelletier, both of which were being unveiled to the convention. There too was a copy of the Constitution, exhibited for all to see, pinned to a desk and protected behind glass. Pretty soon the session devolved into a frenzy. The Hébertiste invaders joined their ideological counterparts from among the Jacobin Club, Heubois and Billaud-Varenne, in demanding a slew of radical economic reforms. Principally, this meant price controls and seizure of property, stuff that the Committee of Public Safety was doing, but incrementally, and not on the scale demanded. The Hébertistes wanted these policies to be permanent. Danton, estranged from the Montagnard as he was, took the chance here to ingratiate himself with the Hébertistes, and reiterated a recently passed proposal that suspected enemies of the state be immediately arrested, and the Committee of General Security have a free hand to eliminate counter-revolutionaries. To quote the Jacobin Hébertistes, terror was to be the order of the day. So already, you can see that the Hébertistes and the convention didn't actually disagree on all too much. This was more about overcoming the convention's reticence to take drastic action. But no doubt there was some pained sighs when money entered the equation. Calls were springing up for a revolutionary army, in which every citizen be given a musket and sent to fight. Danton proposed 100 million livres at minimum from the manufacture of said muskets. Moreover, he supported numerous populist positions that would carry a hefty sum. Satisfied that they had got what they came for, the Hébertistes dipped, and the convention ratified the day's proposals. The very next day, September 6th, Heubois and Billaud-Varenne were appointed to the Committee of Public Safety. Billaud-Varenne focused on economic matters, and had the prices on essential goods permanently fixed under a system called the Maximum Général. The maximum was fully implemented by September 29th, and fixed the prices of 39 critical commodities at their price in 1790, with one-third of the price added to account for inflation. Wages were also increased by 50% from 1790 levels to compensate. This didn't put hunger to an end overnight, but it did ensure that it wouldn't be as much of a problem going forward. Heubois, meanwhile, took until mid-September to issue laws empowering the vigilance committees to detain suspected counter-revolutionaries. This wasn't great for justice in France, as the committees weren't exactly the most even-keeled bodies. They applied the concept of incivisme, meaning something like uncitizenlike, and used that as a justification to regularly deny certificates of good citizenship to personal rivals or those not fully in for the revolution. This all but guaranteed that innocent men and women were sent to face the revolutionary tribunal, and sometimes the guillotine. And thus began a period that is referred to in histories of the French Revolution as the Reign of Terror. Now, the terror was not a term used at the time. The demands of the Hébertistes, that terror be the order of the day, were abstract rhetorical devices, allusions made to episodes of sectarian violence of centuries past, specifically the French Wars of Religion. The label the Terror was a later invention of the Thermidorians, and carried by French historians of the 19th century. These historians did so not in the least because it painted the Montagnard in a bad light, and most of these historians were moderate Republicans, so in other words, very sympathetic to the Girondins. Indeed, at the time, none of the infamous purveyors of the Terror were aware that they were embarking on what was to be one of the bloodiest episodes in revolutionary history. As far as Saint-Just, Robespierre, Danton and all the rest saw it, they were in the shit, fighting a bloody fight to preserve the Republic and achieve the promises of the revolution. To them, this was an intense period of tough decisions and full measures meant to stave off disaster. Thus, the Terror must be divided a couple of ways. Firstly, there is the political Terror, basically a period of wholesale reform pushed through by the Committee of Public Safety. Though they would have preferred to institute the Constitution of 1793, there was a war to win. So decision-making was left in the hands of 12 men, not at all democratic or deliberative, and so arguably terror of a political sort. Next, we have the more infamous terror, that of Madame la Guillotine, of tribunals, of streets running red with blood. And look, most of that stuff you've read and heard is probably true. It did happen. But in all likelihood, what you've seen and read centers this aspect of the terror as the only aspect of the terror, and may well be coloured by anti-revolutionary historiography from the 19th and 20th centuries. It's only been fairly recently, maybe the last few decades, that there's been a reappraisal of the terror which I broadly agree with. Basically, all the awful stuff must be viewed in its proper context. It must also be borne in mind that there's an early terror, that is to say what's kicking off right now, which will last until about January of 1794, at which point things will cool, and acquittals will start to become way more common than sentences of death. And finally, this terror, this Republican terror, Jacobin terror, Red terror, whatever you want to call it, will pale in comparison to subsequent periods of vicious political reprisal that will occur over the next few decades of French history. There's going to be one in just a few months. The conservative backlash to the revolution, the Thermidorian reaction. Once the revolution is over, Napoleon exiled to Elba, and the Bourbons restored in 1814, they will launch a white terror, in which thousands of Republicans and Bonapartists will be killed. Another even larger white terror will occur after the 1815 restoration, in which thousands more will die. Hell, if we extend this out to include the Paris Commune of 1871, then the terror of 1793 looks quaint, against the mass executions of men, women and children, mown down by machine gun fire and buried in unmarked mass graves. Half the reason this terror of 93 is remembered as the bad one is because it's called the Terror. If it had been called something more fitting, like the "fuck me, this is it boys, clock's ticking, let's do what we can while there's still time," then we'd have a much different collective recollection of this period, from August of 1793 to June of 1794. That all being said, I don't want to make it sound like I endorse the violence. I do, however, think that the violence is hyper-fixated upon to otherwise discredit the French Revolution. I think we have to uncouple the terror from over 2 centuries of skewed opinion. That's my bias, just bear that in mind. I have something of a revisionist take on the terror. But look, it was a pretty gruesome affair. It was the explicit aim of the Committee of Public Safety, working through the tribunal, to terrorise counter-revolutionaries. Very little was off the table. Murder, extortion, bribery, execution without appeal. These efforts were meant to be conducted within the confines of the law, but overzealous representatives on mission, or merciless judges, frequently overstepped their mandates. And as the terror swept across France like a bushfire, enemies were seen everywhere, and the Revolutionary Tribunal went about its bloody work with gusto. With evidence provided to them by the Committee of General Security, they compiled a list of names called the General List of the Condemned. After perfunctory trials, those listed were publicly guillotined. In Paris alone, over 3,000 would be guillotined during the terror. Another 14,000 would be dispatched out in the departments. One English observer remarked, "The shrieks of death were blended with the yell of the assassin and the laughter of the buffoons." In these early days of the terror, very few of those killed could be considered guilty of any capital crime. The General List of the Condemned makes for grim reading. A journeyman convicted of sawing down a tree of liberty, executed 6th of September. A man put to death for having lost his temper at cards. An innkeeper guillotined for having served soldiers tainted wine. Sentences of death were handed out like lollipops, and often carried out within a few days. This exacerbated the problem of clerical issues and cases of mistaken identity. In one instance, a female prisoner was brought before the tribunal. She had been mistaken for another woman with a similar name, but this didn't matter to the tribunal. The prosecutor said, "Well, since she's here, let's take her." She met her end a few hours later. The prosecutor likely responsible for this crime was as ruthless as he was biased. Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville was a lawyer of some skill but no great renown prior to the revolution. But a fortuitous connection to the revolutionary favourite Camille Desmoulins, they were cousins, meant that Tinville was appointed to the original Revolutionary Tribunal back in August. Here, he was again professional but unremarkable. Thus Tinville was not a primary pick to serve as the public prosecutor for the new Revolutionary Tribunal. Nonetheless, he got the gig on March 15th, less than a week after the tribunal's formation, and it's here that he truly earned his nasty reputation. Tinville was quiet, composed, and extremely dutiful in his public vivisections of accused counter-revolutionaries. He tore the accused to pieces with lethal, rapid-fire accusations. A lack of hard evidence, as was usually the case, scarcely slowed Tinville. His appeals to the jury were principally rhetorical and theoretical, that is to say, what damage might be done if the accused was freed and left to spread the counter-revolution. His final recommendation was forwarded to the presiding judge, and there was an understanding that Tinville's verdict was also the verdict of the Committee of Public Safety. The judiciary was independent though, and the president of the tribunal, effectively the chief judge, Jacques-Bernard-Marie Montagnier, did see fit to acquit many of the accused. This was not to Tinville's liking, not one bit. On July 29th, Tinville publicly declared that Montagnier was weak-willed and soft-hearted, unfit to pass judgment on enemies of the Republic. Tinville got his way, and Martial Herman, a former police commissioner, was made the new president. Together it was Tinville and Herman who formed a dynamic duo, the razor's edge of the terror. The duo got the terror rolling in August, but their efforts were centred in, on and around Paris. But the wakes they made rippled out into the departments too. As we know, towns and cities controlled by patriots appointed their own tribunals to deal with counter-revolutionaries. But this was decentralised and done on an ad hoc basis, with little official oversight. This was rectified in August as over the next few months, the Committee of Public Safety began to dispatch or retask representatives on mission to oversee these tribunals. They often went in pairs. Paul Borat and Louis Freron sent to Toulon, Herbois and Joseph Fouché sent to Lyon to suppress a federalist revolt. Likewise, Jean-Baptiste Carrier was sent to Nantes to deal with thousands of prisoners captured during the Vendée uprising. Scouring the north of France, Joseph Le Bon revelled in the butchery, often parrying the death throes of his victims. Jean Tallien, based in Bordeaux, went a step further and psychologically tortured his victims before they were put to death. One woman who had wept as her husband was guillotined was made to sit under the blade, becoming soaked in his blood over several hours until she too was guillotined. Strictly speaking, the Revolutionary Tribunal frowned on such excesses. Their campaign was about bringing justice to criminals, not inhumanely prolonging their punishments. The guillotine was the ultimate symbol of this unflinching exactment of revolutionary justice. A quick, clean method of execution. But while the stated belief was that justice was unfeeling and impartial, the truth was that public executions on such an unprecedented scale made for excellent sport. As one observer reporting on the executions in Lyon noted in a letter sent back to his friend in Paris, "How you would have enjoyed it, worthy indeed of liberty." Regional tribunals were further empowered on September 17th with the passing of the Law of Suspects, which gave their attendant surveillance committees unrestrained authority to monitor and arrest any suspected counter-revolutionary. Those arrested fell into broad categories: nobles and priests, unscrupulous merchants, and citizens accused of incivisme or other uncivic behaviours. Sometimes even bearing the name of a known counter-revolutionary or belonging to an unpopular family was reason enough to be arrested and likely guillotined. In Paris, thousands would amass to witness the executions. The location of the executions chopped and changed quite a bit. Initially, they occurred on the Rue Saint-Honoré, but complaints by locals and shop owners about the blood and the stench forced them to relocate. A square nearby the Bastille was chosen for symbolic reasons, but here too the complaints were frequent. So they moved the guillotine to the nearby Place de Trône Renversé, an expeditious choice as this square was not only close to the Bastille, but also a cemetery. Here many of 1793's executions occurred, until the guillotine was again relocated to the Place de la Révolution. And it's here that the most famous executions would occur. The condemned were tried in the Palais de Justice, and then ferried to the guillotine in carts, to be executed in batches. The order was decided by officials on the ground. Bets were often taken about the order in which they would be chosen. Led to the guillotine, the executioners forced the condemned onto the plank, then locked them in place with a tight clamp. A swish thud would follow, all to jubilant cries from the crowd. Any friends or family watching would do well to stay silent. At this early stage of the terror, expressions of sorrow were usually met with a grisly end. For example, a woman who lamented executions for what she called trifling matters was herself sent to the guillotine. The Montagnards were not merely content with putting to death thousands of inconsequential nobodies. Among the condemned were many names rightly familiar to you and me. To bring us up to speed, in the immediate aftermath of the June Journées, which had toppled the Girondins, 22 of their leaders were to be arrested. This included 10 of the 12 members of the Commission of 12, effectively destroying the Commission and allowing the Committee of Public Safety to assume their executive powers. Initially, the Girondins were placed under fairly lax house arrest, which got some of them to thinking, maybe we should escape. Hardliners, led by Brissot, were under no illusions as to what their fate would be. And besides, their political hopes in Paris were for naught. They ought to flee to safety out in the departments, to be welcomed as martyrs to democracy and victims of centralist tyranny. Others disagreed with this plan though. The other two leading Girondins beside Brissot, Vergniaud and Gourdet, were quiescent enough to begin with. The terror had not yet begun, and they maintained hope that they would be freed. Conciliatory Danton was still in power with the Committee of Public Safety. Perhaps he might intercede on their behalf. But it was not to be. Not only was Danton ousted by Robespierre, but further arrest warrants were issued for most of the remaining Girondins, triggering a diaspora. Then the Montagnard-dominated convention officially proscribed the 22 on July 28th. They were to be tried as traitors at the earliest convenience. Remaining Girondins saw the writing on the wall, and those who hadn't already escaped began to flee Paris, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. Very few evaded the Committee of General Security, with its spies and police casting a wide net around the capital. Those that did escape congregated in the north, usually in Normandy. This is why, for example, Charlotte Corday had been able to entice Marat with a promised list of Girondins in Caen. They were fugitives on the run. Marguerite Elie Gourdet was one of the first to flee to Normandy. He did so in late June. Not remaining long, he then trekked south to his home in Aquitaine. Here, Gourdet's luck ran out. Recognized and apprehended, he was taken in chains to Bordeaux. Without wasting any time, the authorities fed him to the guillotine on June 19th. Girondins who managed to escape and stay free ginned up support for the Federalist revolts, marking Girondins' final turn into decentralized federalism. Though spent as a force in national politics, there was still hope that they might effectively utilize the Federalist revolts as a springboard back into power. So for the time being, the remnant Girondins were in league with the rebels embroiled in open fighting against the Montagnard. Back in Paris, the 22 weren't long for this world. Jean-Baptiste Louvet, one of the lucky few Girondins to effect an escape and evade capture, recalled the deplorable conditions under which he and his fellows were kept. Months of interminable suffering passed as the convention busied itself with the trial of Marie Antoinette, which I'll swing around to in a bit. She was guillotined on the 16th of October, a bit over a week later on the 24th, and the tribunal were ready to try the 22. Though the outcome was never in doubt, the trial was something of an unexpected embarrassment for the Montagnard. Remember, the 22 were to a man very talented lawyers, and spoke eloquently in their defense. There wasn't any hope that they would actually be spared, mind you, but it did cause carping. Hébert moped, "Need there be such ceremony about shortening the lives of wretches already condemned by the people?" Again, though, the results were never in doubt. On the 30th, the final day of the trial, all 22 were sentenced to death by guillotine. Upon receiving the sentence, one of the Girondins, named Charles Valazé, revealed a hidden dagger he had spirited away. In full view of the galleries, he stabbed himself in the chest, dying right then and there in the courtroom. The next day, the surviving 21, along with the body of Valazé, were taken in 5 carts down to the Place de la Révolution. Once arrived, one by one they were taken, and if the 19th century historian and politician Alphonse Lamartine is to be believed, their spirits were bright. They sang La Marseillaise and wished long life to the Republic. Lamartine is quite biased though, and spent much of his early career rehabilitating the Girondins, so take that and the following with a grain of salt. Sillery, the oldest of the 22, went first. With confidence he took to the scaffold, bowed, and met his end. Valazé's body was hoisted into place and given a post-mortem execution. 36 minutes after Sillery had died, Vergniaud was guillotined. He chose not to drink the poison he had been given the night before. His reasons died with him. Only a week earlier, on October 16th, Marie Antoinette had been put to death. Where we last saw the former Queen of France, she had suffered a painful parting from Louis. On the morning of his execution, Louis had left without a word, denying his wife a chance at a final farewell. From her room she sat with her sister-in-law Elizabeth and listened as the crowds outside hollered with joy upon receiving word that Louis had been guillotined. At the death of her brother, Elizabeth was indignant. "Monsters," she had said, "they are satisfied now." Marie Antoinette, by contrast, wanted nothing more than to see Clary, who had been with Louis in his final moments. She believed that he might have had some final message to convey from Louis, but there was no final message, only 2 keepsakes, Louis's wedding ring and some locks of hair. Even these were denied to Marie, Clary wasn't allowed to deliver them in person, and instead a sympathetic Jacobin took it upon himself to deliver the items some weeks later. In the meantime, Marie Antoinette sank into the deepest depths of despair, literally catatonic with grief. For the first few days she did not eat, she did not drink, she barely spoke, she did not go outside to the balcony for fear of walking past Louis's now vacant room. Her sister believed that such a shock might break her waning spirit. Marie's daughter, Marie Theresa, later said she no longer had any hope left in her heart or distinguished between life and death. The only interest she showed in these first few days was to observe a proper period of mourning for her late husband. She requested a black dress, which was allowed. This marked a rare moment of generosity for the revolutionary authorities, who otherwise mistreated Marie and her children as a matter of policy. Officially, the former queen was now Madame Capet, or more informally, the Widow Capet. The royal suffix Antoinette was omitted entirely. They also routinely denied simpler requests and kept them separate. Excuses had to be found by the royal family to spend time with each other. Marie Theresa accidentally cut herself on the 25th. Marie Antoinette would not allow her daughter to be treated by the prison doctor and took up the task herself, spending some precious few hours together. Nonetheless, individuals here and there were compassionate and kind. The guards were ever present, but agreeable. Marie had always been generous to her servants, and they reciprocated with dutiful and honest service. The official appointed to oversee the royal family tried his best to ease their suffering. Outside of the Tower, the question of just what would become of the royal family now that Louis was dead were very lively topics. In French émigré communities in Britain, Austria, the Rhineland and elsewhere, these questions centered on the succession. Louis Charles, the Duc de Normandy, at a mere 8 years old, was now technically Louis XVII of France. But of course the boy king was locked away in Paris, and in the meantime, the Comte de Provence declared himself regent for Louis Charles. The Austrians weren't too pleased about this. They believed that the succession ought to recognise Marie Antoinette's role as Queen Regent. And many émigrés rightly pointed out that immediately declaring Louis Charles to be king put his life in extreme danger. The revolutionaries had guillotined one king already. Would they really balk at killing another, even if he was only a child? Louis Charles, for his part, became something like the soul of the family at this time. He was saddened, of course, by the death of his father, but was truly and deeply affected by the suffering of his mother. Being so young, he was not kept far from her, being perhaps Marie's only source of comfort. On the night of February 7th, he and his sister performed a lament to the late king. Louis sang, and Marie Theresa played the harpsichord. It was generally taken as given by most of the émigrés that the royal family would come to no harm. There was no gain in killing hostages. Furthermore, the émigrés pored through their history books and determined that there was no such precedent, and thus nothing to fear. Why exactly they believed that the revolutionaries cared at all about precedent is beyond me, but nonetheless, these beliefs were enough to quash any talk of exchanging the royal family for some high-value prisoners. The enemies of France took a wait-and-see approach. And indeed, within the convention, there was no great desire to take any drastic action. During Louis's trial, the de facto position of both the defense and the prosecution had been that Marie Antoinette was not of any real concern. She was, like all Frenchmen, a citizen, nothing more, nothing less. The convention's official position was that should Marie Antoinette be deemed guilty of any crimes, she would, in the words of Robespierre, go before the courts. As the weeks wore on, the idea of clemency was bandied about. The main reason for this was the Queen's health. Not only was she in a state of mental anguish, but Marie Antoinette bled frequently. Explanations vary from undiagnosed or untreated injuries sustained during childbirth, to early onset menopause, or even ovarian or stomach cancer. She also suffered from a recurrent bloody cough, a strong indicator of tuberculosis. In this state, Marie rebuffed plots made by sympathetic officials or royalist agents to spring her and her family from prison. The only clandestine activity she engaged in was in the secret delivery of letters to faraway allies. Through her attendant steward, she signed and sealed a letter to the Comte de Provence, renouncing her claims to the regency. The authenticity of these letters was assured by a lock of her hair, Louis's wedding ring, and a postscriptum from the children. Marie also sent a letter to the Count von Fersen, reaffirming her love. Though this letter didn't reach the Count until January of 1794, months after Marie's death. Dumouriez's defeat and subsequent betrayal marked a turning point in the convention's attitude towards the Queen. Not only were enemies once again menacing Paris, but the Girondins, voices in favour of clemency for the royal family, were fatally discredited. This allowed space for Hébert and Robespierre to force a hard line. While Hébert published screeds against the Widow Capet and personally led unscheduled searches of the temple, Robespierre made an about-face from December and focused in on Marie Antoinette as a criminal on par with her late husband. Again though, the Girondins did offer some resistance. even if both the Revolutionary Tribunal and the Committee of Public Safety had Marie squarely in their sights. This all changed in June when the Girondins were purged. The most immediate effect for Marie was intense scrutiny. All sympathetic guards and attendants were removed, bars were installed on the windows, and frequent searches made. While Robespierre pushed for a trial, Danton was one of the few Montagnards to push back. He had been trying since March to exchange the royal family for the commissioners captured by Dumouriez and handed over to the Austrians. They, however, expressed little interest in Marie Antoinette, but were concerned about Louis XVII. So too was the convention. Plenty of plots at escape had been uncovered and foiled, the most recent one in June involving the Baron de Batz, no less. This led the convention to decide on July 2nd to remove Louis Charles from the tower. Marie was informed of this the next day. It was to take effect immediately with no appeal. Marie Theresa recounted what happened next. My mother was horrified by this cruel order and refused to give him up. She defended his bed against the men who had come to take him away, but they insisted on taking him and threatened to use force. We got Louis Charles up, and when he was dressed, my mother handed him over, crying over him, as if she knew she would never see him again. The poor little fellow kissed us all tenderly and departed in tears with the men. Marie Theresa's account is somewhat watered down. Marie Antoinette resisted for over an hour, ignoring threats on her life from the guards. Only a very sincere threat to kill Marie Theresa then and there compelled her to relinquish Louis Charles. The boy king was remanded into the custody of Antoine Simon on the order of Pierre Chaumette. Chaumette believed that Louis Charles could be reconditioned into a model revolutionary citizen to, quote, lose the idea of his rank. Simon was an excellent choice. He had been the royal family servant these past few months in the temple. They had recalled Simon as being coarse, but honest and helpful. Opinion on the hulking lump of a man changed literally overnight. Louis Charles wasn't too far away just yet, still living in the temple. Marie Theresa reported that her mother wept knowing that it was Simon who would take care of her son. Marie Theresa also reported some almost certainly made-up stories about Louis Charles being made to wear a Phrygian cap, disavow his family, and sing revolutionary songs. The truth was somewhere in between. Louis Charles spent most of these early days of separation crying until Simon beat the tendency out of him. The boy was also given wine and spent some time with his jailers. The reconditioning took hold of a young, impressionable child. For the rest of July, Marie would strain herself for hours at a time to peer out of her window, catching occasional glimpses of her son. These would be the last time she ever saw him. July witnessed a series of military reversals for France. Valenciennes would fall a month later in September. Paris was once again under threat. Bertrand Barrère made allusions to her crimes and stated, "Was it our strange indifference to the Capet family that has given the nation's enemies a mistaken impression of our weakness?" At 2 a.m. on August 1st, an armed guard arrived at the temple to escort Marie to a new prison, the Concierge. She dressed under their watchful gaze and took only a few personal items. Manhandled out of her room, Marie beseeched Marie Theresa to listen to Auntie Elizabeth. On the way outside, she was inadvertently pushed into a low-hanging beam, striking her head. In the Concierge, Marie Antoinette was confined to a cramped cell. She was attended by a young girl named Rosalie, who recalled the former queen as being quiet and respectful. She insisted on dressing and washing herself. Rosalie slept on a bed in the same room. So too did 2 guards. Marie was under 24-hour supervision. Day by day she read and crocheted. Unlike at the temple, the Concierge was busy. Lawyers coming and going, prisoners screaming and laughing, guards levelling taunts. Despite the initial secrecy of her relocation, Marie became a public spectacle, and onlookers paraded by day and night to catch a glimpse of the widow Capet. Marie's only hope was for an exchange. But by September, her quiet benefactor Danton had lost all influence and been ousted from the Committee of Public Safety. Hopes to exchange the Queen for the commissioners were dashed. So too was a plan to literally buy her freedom. As it was, though, the Austrians had no interest in rescuing Marie. Francis II considered her a walking womb. Having borne an heir to the throne, Marie Antoinette's purpose was served. But she didn't know she'd been abandoned. Instead, believing help was on the way, she bore her hardships stoically. Some comfort was to be found in the presence of several Carmelite nuns who were held in nearby cells. Together, Marie and the nuns prayed. A late-night meeting of the Committee of Public Safety on September 2nd produced a commitment from its members that the Queen would be brought to trial and found guilty. Hébert was the force behind this decision, claiming that to deny the sans-culottes this blood sacrifice would be a grave miscalculation. Quote, "I have promised the head of Antoinette. I'll go and cut it off myself if there's any delay in giving it to me. This I have promised on your behalf to the Sans-Culottes, without whom you would cease to be." In the days following the decision, another plot to spring the Queen was uncovered and foiled. This provided excellent cover for the committee to make the case for a trial. In mid-September, Marie was moved to another cell, set deep within the concierge. Now she could barely read. The only light came from outside, through a single, tiny barred window. Public opinion of Marie Antoinette had always been abysmal, and on the eve of her trial, this was no different. Hébert l'Ambassadeur and pamphleteers produced lists of charges and crimes committed by the former queen, a return to the labels of yesteryear. But there was still a deep pool of sympathisers, some within the concierge and others within positions of power. These sympathies evaporated in the wake of falsified charges levelled by Marie's own son. Louis Charles, plied with alcohol, beaten and broken, now turned against his mother. Hébert saw an opportunity and made a list of crimes he wanted Louis Charles to claim were committed by his mother and aunt. Let's be clear, these claims were made up. False, fake, fabricated, complete bullshit. The boy claimed he had been sexually abused, that an injury to one of his testicles sustained way back in May or June when he was playing with a stick was in fact the result of being squished between two beds and presumably sodomized. Again, these charges are literal lies. When cross-examined and then confronted by both his aunt and Marie-Theresa, Louis Charles could produce no details of his supposed abuse. But that didn't matter. The accusations were the point. Hébert had more than enough to destroy Marie Antoinette. In late September, when the law of suspects was passed, her trial was given the green light. On October 12th, she was dragged from the concierge and delivered to Hermin and Tinville. Here they interrogated her for hours, going through a list of charges. These included real charges, like having been in on the Polignac group, if you can remember that from the pre-revolution. And then there were the fake charges, stuff like having participated in a literal orgy in October of 1789. They also accused her of being the mastermind behind most of Louis's crimes, the flight to Varennes, various royalist uprisings, and collusions with émigrés. Naturally, she denied all charges. Before being taken away, Hermin asked if she wanted a defense counsel for her trial. She said she did. The next day 2 lawyers were appointed to her. Their first task was getting Marie to sign off and asking for a reprieve. After some hesitation, she wrote to Hermin asking for 3 days reprieve. The letter was ignored. There would be no respite. On the 14th, the trial began. The defense didn't even have enough time to fill out their paperwork, let alone mount an effective defense. So sat in an armchair, perched on a raised platform in the center of the courtroom, Marie Antoinette was subjected to 2 days of vicious, direct, and almost universally untrue accusations. Chief Prosecutor Tinville delivered these charges rapid fire, only stopping to let witnesses provide evidence, which invariably consisted of regurgitations of Hébertiste propaganda. Marie was permitted to speak in her defense. Her answers were almost always in the negative. Through most of the trial, she remained calm. The 5 judges, led by Hermin, presided, decidedly unimpressed. The only charges worth mentioning are the charges levelled by Hébert about incest and sexual assault. He delivered his supposed proof, and a speech decrying Marie's character. She demanded to know if Hébert had seen proof of these crimes. He replied that he had not seen it personally, but had the written accounts of several trustworthy officials, by which he meant a single doctor he had bribed. Proceedings then moved on, without Marie answering to these specific charges of incest. A member of the 12-man jury sprang forth and demanded Hermin return to get some answers. He wanted Hermin to force Marie to admit her guilt. For a fleeting moment, Marie's composure was shattered by such slanderous and patently untrue accusations. If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all mothers who may be present. Otherwise trenchant critics, mostly female sans-culottes among the crowds, were stirred to action and demanded the trial be halted. The jury, all men, were unmoved. The first day session had begun in the early morning and ran until about 11 p.m. The second day was the same. Many of the lines of questioning were continuations. She, for instance, named Fersen as the conspirator in the flight to Varennes. She also refuted the point made continuously despite any proof that Lafayette had anything to do with the flight. After an afternoon recess in which Rosalie brought Marie something to eat, the onslaught resumed. Henri d'Estaing, that admiral from episode 6, who had proven pretty successful during the American War of Independence, well, he was called to the stand and defended the Queen. His defense was admirable, but unnecessary. His testimony would not save Marie, and in the end it only ensured he would in coming months share her fate. Clearly, despite the fact that the guilty verdict wasn't in doubt, Urmain, Tinville, and Hebert could sense that this trial was not absolutely destroying Marie's reputation as was expected. So they called for some hard evidence. Simon took to the stand to confirm all of the reports about sexual misconduct. Later, a witness who had perused paperwork after the sack of the Tuileries recollected seeing the Queen's signature on an invoice for 80,000 livres. The date was supposedly August 10th, and as Marie quickly pointed out, she had been whisked away to the National Assembly at the Salle de Ménage by 8 in the morning. When exactly was she supposed to have taken the time to sign this document? But the prosecution wasn't done embarrassing itself yet. Dozens of witnesses were whipped out to prove concocted charges. Her personal possessions had been seized and rummaged through. Locks of hair from Louis, Louis Charles, Marie Theresa, and probably others was trotted out as proof of something. I literally have no idea. Actual math homework written by Louis Charles was pretended to be figures embezzled or sent to émigrés. Expense reports predating the revolution were also used. The Queen was accused of overspending on a vanity project, the construction of the Petit Trianon. This was a weird angle of attack, because it's certainly true that the Queen had overspent on furnishing the Petit Trianon, but it was constructed in 1762. She would have been 7 years old at the time, and still an Austrian princess, living in Vienna. Tinville even dredged up the diamond necklace affair as though it was some kind of gotcha. All Marie had to do was tell the truth. Did you have any involvement? No. She was accused of declaring Louis Charles king, of teaching him how to be a king, of sitting him at the head of a table like a king. Again, she just told the truth. No. At one point, refuting charges made up by her son, she delivered a stinging reply. It is extremely easy to make a child of 8 say anything you want. In purely legal terms, even by the standards set by and expected by the Revolutionary Tribunal, nothing had been proved. Just like with the trial of Louis XVI, long on accusations, short on proof. But just like with that trial, Marie Antoinette's trial was of far too much political importance to let evidence, proof, or the rule of law interfere with a guilty verdict. As Marie was led away, out of earshot, Tinville silenced the court and summarised the prosecution's case for the jury. The charges were depletion of the state treasury, high treason, and conspiracy against the revolution. No mention was made of Louis Charles, or the diamond necklace affair, any of that. It had all been brought up as poison, not proof, and now dropped at the last minute. Tinville referred the jury to the proof provided at Louis' trial, the contents of the infamous armoire de fer. The mere existence of this evidence, none of which was present at Marie's trial, Tinville deemed sufficient to get the jury to vote the Queen guilty. She and many spectators allowed themselves to be seduced by hope. They believed she would be ransomed or deported, something like that. Instead, in the early hours of October 16th, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Marie Antoinette was made to read the indictment aloud. After this ordeal, she was stunned. Quiet and composed as ever, but rendered completely inert. Urmain followed this up with his determination. Marie Antoinette would be guillotined. If we can call it mercy, the tribunal did allow Marie Antoinette to write a farewell letter to Elizabeth. In it, she lamented the sentence of death, but declared that she would, quote, demonstrate the same firmness Louis had showed at the end. Marie Antoinette echoed the same sentiment she had expressed to her daughter, Marie Theresa, when they had last spoke. Be loyal to your aunt and stay safe. Of Louis Charles, she asked Elizabeth and Marie Theresa to forgive him. Quote, think of his age, and how easy it is to make a child say whatever one wants. She also asked the boy that he renounce vengeance, just as Louis had. A priest was sent to Marie Antoinette that she might take a final communion. But this she refused. She would die Catholic, untainted by the juring priests. For her final few hours, Marie Antoinette was attended by Rosalie. There wasn't much to be done. Marie refused to eat, and she had already dressed herself in a black dress, possibly the same dress she had worn for Louis's mourning. Sometime before midday, Henri Sanson, son of the famed Sanson Sr. and one of the executioners present at Louis's execution, appeared before the condemned. By now she had been forced to change out of her black dress into a less symbolic white dress, and also because some of her dress was stained in blood from her no doubt tattered lungs. Sanson cut her grey hair short with enormous heavy-duty scissors, pocketing the offcuts. She protested when her hands were bound. Without any ceremony, she was then led outside towards a carriage. Marie wavered, losing control of her bladder. The procession waited while she relieved herself in the confined courtyard. The journey from the concierge to the Place de la Concorde was fraught. Marie Antoinette was spat at, heckled, and abused. Jacques-Louis David made this famous sketch of her in these final moments, taking pains to portray what he saw as Austrian arrogance. But this was not arrogance. Everyone could agree that Marie Antoinette went to the scaffold with grace. A priest was present, but he was studiously ignored by the former queen. Once arrived, she eagerly bolted up the steps of the scaffold. Too eagerly, as it happened. She took a faulty step and accidentally trod on the younger Sanson. She apologized. No offense was taken. Moments later, Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, wife of King Louis, and mother of 2 surviving children, was guillotined. Like almost all of the victims of the Terror, her body was disposed of in the most expeditious manner, thrown into a mass grave. At least among the French, she was not missed. Even her extended family in Austria noted the event with strained relief. It was only her family remaining in Paris, still in immediate danger, who truly mourned the late Queen of France. Marie Antoinette was only one on a whole list of names familiar to us who were guillotined during the Terror. In the months prior to October, and for the months following, plenty of people we've met will receive what the revolutionaries like to call a very short haircut. Olympe de Gouges, feminist writer of the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, and a vocal Girondin, was arrested in June with the rest of the Girondins and guillotined on November 3rd. A few days later, on the 6th, Philippe Égalité was guillotined. Granted a 24-hour reprieve, he set his affairs in order, hosted a lavish feast in a time of great hardship, and then met his end. Madame Roland was arrested in June and faced trial on November 8th. She was guillotined the next day. Her last words are rightly infamous. "O liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?" 2 days later, Jean Roland, hidden away in Normandy, received word of his wife's death. Unable to bear the pain, he wrote a suicide note, pinned it to his chest, and impaled himself with a sword, pinning he and the letter to a tree. Scientist, politician, and former mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, was caught in July. After refusing to testify against Marie Antoinette in October, he was found guilty by the tribunal for having orchestrated the Champ de Mars massacre. Indeed, he was meant to be guillotined in the Champ de Mars on November 12th in an act of symbolic retribution. But the crowds were particularly merciless and had the guillotine relocated to a very scenic dung heap. There, Bailly was executed. Antoine Bernave had been arrested way back in 1792 on charges of fomenting counter-revolution. He was definitely guilty. Extensive correspondence with Marie Antoinette certainly didn't help matters, so this was an open and shut case for the tribunal. Bernave was guillotined along with some former ministers on November 29th. Not long after, the decrepit courtesan Madame du Barry, former mistress to Louis XV, was tried by the tribunal. Life outside of court had been tough for the Madame. Always reviled, she garnered no sympathy for maintaining a personal slave on French soil, something that had been illegal even under the Ancien regime. After pawning her jewellery in England, she returned to France, whereupon the mistreatment of her slave caused him to denounce her to the Committee of Public Safety. Madame du Barry was sent to the guillotine on the 8th of December, her squealing cut short by Sanson's blade. 1794 saw the executions continue. In addition to senior generals Custine and Biron, who met their end, so too did Admiral d'Estaing. He was on the shit list after testifying in the Queen's defence, and was sent to the guillotine on the 28th of April. His final words are pretty ironic. "After you strike my head, send it to the British. They will pay a great deal for it." It might have been a cool quote, if in fact anyone in Britain could even remember the Comte. So as 1794 looms, we're entering the final stages of the revolution, defined by brutal suppression of the Republic's domestic enemies on the home front, and on the strategic side of things, the destruction of dozens of enemy armies arrayed against the Republic. The Terror will wind down, the bloodlust of the enragés sated. The Jacobins are left standing as the dominant political power in the Republic. The war will demand the continued contributions of the entire nation. And before it's all over, things are going to take some wild turns, proving that though France would not suffer tyrants, they would suffer fools.